Welcome to While We Were Distracted, the podcast where we explore topics that often get overshadowed in the rush of daily life.
So imagine the next time you tap a button on your phone to order like pad thai or a pizza. You probably think you're just buying dinner, right?
Right, yeah. That's what most people think.
But you aren't. You're actually, firing a tiny micro shot in this massive 13 billion euro corporate war.
Oh, absolutely. It's wild.
Because right now, behind that totally simple interface of your takeout app, there's this intense battle happening. You've got European regulators, American tech giants, and hostile activist investors all fighting.
Yeah, fighting a really bloody, high-stakes battle over who controls the whole global food delivery infrastructure.
Exactly. And it's just a phenomenal collision of forces right now.
It really is. I mean, we're basically watching the end of that fragmented, hyper-competitive era of food delivery.
The era where you had like a dozen different apps fighting for space on your home screen?
Exactly. That's rapidly coming to an end. The pieces on this global chessboard are entire regional economies now, and the players making the moves. They're armed with war chests that completely dwarf the GDP of small nations.
Yeah, we are absolutely in the middle of a massive consolidation wave. The whole landscape is just shrinking into the hands of a few absolute mega players.
Right. Just look at the recent board movements.
Yeah, I mean, DoorDash executed a £2.9 billion takeover of Deliveroo, and Prosus dropped 4.1 billion euros to acquire Just Eat Takeaway.
Which is just staggering money. And that turns the remaining independent platforms into these highly coveted, incredibly vulnerable targets.
Because the math of the delivery business fundamentally requires scale, right?
Oh, 100%.
Yeah.
If you can't achieve absolute market dominance in a specific region, your profit margins just, they simply evaporate.
Just crushed under the weight of logistics and marketing costs.
Exactly.
Okay, let's unpack this. Our mission for today's deep dive is to extract the absolute core insights from some bombshell reporting we have from the Financial Times.
Yeah, that reporting on the fierce bidding war for Delivery Hero.
Right, the German food delivery giant. We were looking at this crazy standoff involving Uber, DoorDash, European antitrust regulators, and literally tens of billions of euros.
And, the craziest part, the catalyst for all of this wasn't some boring press release or an earnings call.
No, it was a surprise flight to Norway.
Yeah. Dora Khosrowshahi, the CEO of Uber, physically flying to Oslo. I mean, that is a profound statement of intent.
Right, because in an era of endless Zoom calls and digital deal making, you don't just show up in person unless it's serious.
Exactly. Showing up at the doorstep of Kristen Skogan Lund. She's the chair of Delivery Hero's supervisory board, by the way. It basically signals that all the standard corporate defense mechanisms are being bypassed.
He didn't just show up to chat about the Scandinavian weather either.
No, definitely not.
He floated an indicative proposal to buy the whole company for about 33 euros per share.
Which, just to put that in perspective for you listening, that values Delivery Hero at over 10 billion euros.
10 billion. And the response from Delivery Hero's board was essentially like a very polite corporate cold shoulder.
Yeah, they literally just stated they remain focused on their internal, quote-unquote, strategic review process.
Which is hilarious, because a strategic review process is often just corporate code for we are painfully aware we are undervalued.
Right, and we're trying to find a way to pump up our stock price before someone forcibly buys us.
Exactly. Delivery Hero's board knows a 10 billion euro offer is just a lowball maneuver. Uber is just testing their resolve.
But to understand why Delivery Hero felt confident enough to just walk away from 10 billion euros, we have to look at the leverage Uber already had.
Right, the leverage they had before Khosrowshahi even boarded that plane to Oslo.
Exactly.
It's kind of like, well, think of it this way. It's one thing if a stranger knocks on your door and offers to buy your house.
Sure.
It's a completely different psychological dynamic if that person has already, legally purchased your driveway, your front lawn, and the airspace above your roof.
That is a perfect analogy. Because Uber recently disclosed owning a 19.5% stake in Delivery Hero.
Plus another 5.6% in derivatives, right?
Right. What's fascinating here is where the financial engineering gets really aggressive. Because Morgan Stanley...
Wait, the bank advising Uber?
Yes, the bank advising Uber on this exact bid. They also disclosed that they hold a massive 27% interest in Delivery Hero.
Wow, 27%.
Yeah, primarily through what are called equity swaps.
Let's break down the mechanics of an equity swap for a second, because, that term gets thrown around a lot in these hostile takeovers.
It does, and it can be confusing.
So think of an equity swap like betting heavily on a horse without actually buying the horse.
Right, yeah.
Morgan Stanley holds the underlying assets, so they absorb the literal ownership on paper, but they pass the economic returns, like the upside or downside of the stock price, over to Uber.
Exactly. So Uber gets all the financial exposure without officially holding the voting shares.
Which is incredibly sneaky.
Well, the tactical advantage of that financial camouflage really cannot be overstated.
Yeah.
Because under German corporate law, there are strict rules.
Right, the 30% rule.
Yes. If any entity acquires a 30% voting rights stake in a publicly traded company, it triggers an immediate legal obligation to make a mandatory takeover offer for the entire company.
It's a mechanism designed to protect minority shareholders from, creeping takeovers.
Exactly.
So Uber is basically playing a deliberate, hyper-calculated game of chicken with German regulators.
Yes, they absolutely are.
By using these derivatives and having Morgan Stanley hold the equity swaps, Uber is hovering at 29-point-something% of effective influence.
Right. So they get the entire financial footprint. They basically park their tanks right on Delivery Hero's lawn to scare off other potential buyers.
But they completely dodged that legal tripwire, the one that would force them to buy the whole company before they are actually ready.
Exactly. They cornered the board without firing a single legally binding shot.
That's brilliant. Terrifying, but brilliant.
And Uber even issued statements previously claiming they had no intent to acquire 30% or more of the voting rights. But of course, they very carefully left the option open to increase their stake later.
Right. They established a new baseline reality. Any future for Delivery Hero has to go through Uber.
But despite all of that pressure, Delivery Hero still said no.
Yeah, the board looked at that €33 offer and essentially laughed because the shareholders are aggressively demanding a price floor above €40 per share.
Which is a 19% premium.
Right, and that would value the whole company at roughly €13 billion.
And to really understand that 13 billion number, we have to transition from the stealth accumulation of stock to the actual valuation math of global food delivery.
Right, because the public markets are radically mispricing Delivery Hero's individual parts, aren't they?
Oh, entirely. The company is this massive, sprawling conglomerate. And in this sector, global conglomerates suffer from what analysts call a holding company discount.
Because of the overhead.
Yeah, the sheer overhead of managing operations across dozens of disparate countries. Plus, you have highly profitable regional divisions that end up subsidizing deeply unprofitable ones.
Right, which just drags down the overall share price of the parent company.
Exactly.
Which perfectly sets up the tension we're seeing with DoorDash, because Tony Zhu, the CEO of DoorDash, has also been burning up the phone lines to the board in Oslo.
Yeah, he has. But DoorDash doesn't seem to want this sprawling global headache that Uber might be willing to take on.
No, they are specifically aggressively targeting Delivery Hero's Middle East business, brands like Talabat and Hunger Station.
And their Turkish arm, Yemek Sepeti.
Right, because the Middle East represents the absolute crown jewels of Delivery Hero's portfolio.
Definitely. I mean, the population density, the incredibly high adoption rate of delivery apps there, and the established logistics networks, it makes it an absolute cash machine.
And the shareholders know it. They're actively arguing that Delivery Hero's 80% stake in Talabat alone is worth up to €9 billion on the open market.
Which is a massive number.
Okay, wait. Let's run the numbers on this for a second, because the math feels completely inverted to me. So the Middle East arm is allegedly worth €9 billion.
Right.
And meanwhile, Uber actually teamed up with the South Korean internet giant Naver to make a joint bid just for Delivery Hero's South Korean arm.
Correct. And that specific regional unit was valued at around €4.6 billion.
Okay, so 9 billion plus 4.6 billion. That's 13.6 billion.
Yeah.
That combined total for just two regional divisions already exceeds the €13 billion price floor that shareholders want for the entire global company.
It sounds crazy, I know.
If the parts are worth more than the whole, why on earth are DoorDash and Uber trying to swallow the entire bloated conglomerate? Why not just buy the pieces?
Because executing a series of fragmented, highly contested regional spin-offs is incredibly messy, and it invites massive competitive bidding.
Oh, I see.
If DoorDash tries to just buy Talabat outright, they will end up in a brutal auction against sovereign wealth funds, private equity firms, and of course, Uber.
So it drives the price
Yeah.
way up.
Exactly. But if Uber or DoorDash can force a complete buyout of the parent company and a slight premium, say, that 13 billion euro mark, they secure the underlying assets at a relative discount.
Ah, it's like buying a struggling global restaurant chain just because they own the patent to a billion-dollar secret sauce.
That's it. That's exactly it.
You buy the whole chain at a discount, you secure the rights to the sauce, and then you just shutter or sell off the underperforming restaurants on your own timeline.
That analogy captures the brutal efficiency of corporate consolidation perfectly. And Delivery Hero's board is agonizing over this exact dilemma right now.
Right, because they have to choose their poison.
Do they endure the grueling multi-year process of spinning off the Middle East and Korea divisions separately to maximize shareholder value, or do they just capitulate to a 13 billion euro buyout and let Uber handle the dissection?
And honestly, their ability to make a clear-headed decision about that dilemma is heavily compromised right now. Because while the external sharks like Uber and DoorDash are circling, there is absolute chaos inside the house. Delivery Hero is dealing with a full-on internal mutiny.
Yeah, the founder and CEO, Nicholas Osberg, he just announced he will leave the company by March 2027.
Which is super weird timing, right? A delayed departure like that is rarely a signal of steady transition.
No, it's almost always the result of a forced compromise. Osberg has been under relentless grinding pressure from Aspects management.
And Aspects is this highly aggressive activist investor group, right? They currently hold a 14.6% stake in the company.
Yes, and Aspects isn't just sending polite suggestion emails to the board.
No, they have been publicly demanding structural changes. They're pushing for a dramatic acceleration of asset sales, and they were explicitly calling for Osberg's removal.
Which is incredibly disruptive. When an entity holding almost 15% of your company starts loudly hanging a for sale sign on your most profitable divisions.
It creates an environment of total corporate paralysis.
Absolutely. Activist investors weaponize instability. By forcing the board to constantly defend its existence and evaluate these asset sales, Aspects broadcasted a signal of distress to the whole global market.
They effectively chummed the waters.
Exactly. Uber and DoorDash didn't initiate this crisis. They simply capitalized on a vulnerability that was engineered from the inside.
But here is the massive structural problem for Aspects or anyone else trying to carve up the company. We have to circle back to Uber's 19.5% stake.
Right, the stake that's just sitting there.
The reporting specifically notes that this stake acts as a massive obstacle to any other suitor. It gives Uber heavy influence and potentially even veto power over capital increases, acquisitions, and crucial changes to the company's constitutional documents.
It functions as a total corporate stranglehold.
Wow.
If DoorDash attempts to execute a clean buyout of Delivery Hero, they inevitably crash directly into Uber's voting bloc.
So Uber can essentially block any strategic move that doesn't serve their own global expansion goals.
Precisely. They are trapping Delivery Hero in a state of suspended animation.
So looking at all these intercepting pressures, the lowball bids, the undervalued regional assets, the activist investors screaming for returns, and Uber's veto power. What is this? Are we watching a hostile American takeover of a struggling European tech champion? Or is this actually a desperately needed rescue mission for a company completely paralyzed by its own internal dysfunction?
Well, the reality of the market is that it is likely both.
Both.
Yeah. Aspects forced the issue by destabilizing the leadership, but Uber and DoorDash still have the luxury of patience.
Right, they can just wait it out.
They could wake up tomorrow, decide the internal restructuring is simply too toxic or complex to untangle, and walk away entirely.
And that would leave Delivery Hero stranded with a fractured board, a lame duck CEO, and a highly volatile stock price.
Which is a terrifying prospect for the shareholders.
Which brings us to the ultimate question of this entire saga. How did we get here?
The origin story.
Yeah, how did Uber manage to acquire that massive initial stake to get inside the gates in the first place?
And the answer to that is one of the most fascinating geopolitical accidents in recent corporate history. We really have to look at the regulatory boomerang.
Because the intersection of corporate maneuvering and international policy is rarely neat, is it?
Never. And in this case, it resulted in a massive strategic misfire by European regulators.
Okay, let's trace the timeline here. Prosus, which is a massive Dutch investment group, they used to be Delivery Hero's largest shareholder.
Right.
But recently, Prosus executed that massive takeover of Just Eat that we mentioned at the start of the deep dive.
Or they bought Just Eat Takeaway.
And the European Union has very strict antitrust requirements. To comply with those mandates regarding the Just Eat acquisition, the EU actively forced Prosus to reduce its holdings in Delivery Hero.
Because the foundational logic of the European Union's regulatory framework is consumer protection through competitive markets.
Makes sense on paper.
Right. They viewed one investment group holding dominant controlling stakes in two major competing European food delivery platforms as an unacceptable anti-monopoly risk.
So they mandated a divestment.
Exactly.
But when you force a massive investor to suddenly sell off hundreds of millions of euros worth of stock, you artificially create a distressed seller.
You do. Prosus had to find a buyer willing to absorb a massive position, and they had to do it quickly.
And who stepped up this past April to buy 270 million euros worth of shares?
Uber.
Uber's own executives literally characterized the deal as opportunistic.
Oh, they knew exactly what they were doing. They recognized a forced liquidation and stepped in to acquire a foundational stake in a prime competitor.
Without having to pay the standard market premium that a normal acquisition would require.
Exactly.
The CEO of Prosus, Fabrizio Bloisi, was absolutely furious about how this played out.
I can imagine.
He issued this really heavy public criticism of European regulators. He warned that by strictly enforcing local antitrust rules and forcing Prosus to sell its stake, the EU essentially manufactured the exact opening required for a full-blown American takeover.
Which is a brutal irony.
He actually stated that this regulatory environment risks making the European Union, and this is a direct quote from the FT reporting, irrelevant in terms of technology.
Wow. And just to be super clear here, as we discuss this, our goal with this deep dive isn't to debate the underlying ethics or the political validity of the EU's strict anti-monopoly laws.
Right, absolutely. We are not taking sides on whether you lean toward free markets or strict consumer protection.
Exactly. That is a massive philosophical debate for another day.
Right.
However, if we connect this to the bigger picture and analyze this from a purely strategic, structural standpoint, we really have to confront the unintended consequences of those regulations.
That is the ultimate sports referee analogy.
How so?
Well, the EU regulators are trying so incredibly hard to enforce the rules fairly and prevent their home teams from playing rough with each other, right? But in doing so, they accidentally score an own goal, handing a victory directly to the visiting American team.
That is painfully accurate. And it's a visiting team that operates with a radically different level of capitalization.
Right.
The structural tension here is profound. The EU's mandate to prevent internal monopolies often results in fragmented, smaller local platforms.
Whereas American tech giants like Uber are deeply subsidized by massive capital markets.
Right, allowing them to operate at a loss for years just to achieve global scale. So when those two philosophies collide, the fragmented local champions become incredibly easy prey for the unified global giants.
And we are seeing the immediate aggressive aftermath of that dynamic right now. Uber isn't just sitting on its Delivery Hero stake, they're rapidly expanding their footprint.
They are. They just announced they're entering 7 new European markets this year alone.
7. They have the capital to simply outlast any regulatory turbulence.
Though, we should note that the legal teams navigating this consolidation still have a very formidable challenge ahead of them.
Right, because the regulators aren't just going to look away.
Exactly. Any final transaction, whether it is Uber taking over the whole entity or DoorDash carving out the Middle Eastern assets, it will inevitably be subjected to review by those very same European regulators who forced the Prosus sale in the first place.
Oh, the irony. So the regulatory friction is far from resolved.
Far from it.
It is just a phenomenal game of three-dimensional corporate chess. Let's pull all these threads together to see the whole tapestry.
Let's do it.
We started with Darko's Roshahi making an unannounced, aggressive play in Oslo, offering 10 billion euros and basically having the door politely shut in his face.
Right. And then we uncovered the financial camouflage of those equity swaps that allowed Uber to dodge German takeover laws while parking their tanks on the lawn.
Then we examined the inverted valuation math, where the sheer structural drag of managing a global conglomerate means highly profitable regional spin-offs in the Middle East and Korea might actually command a higher price than the entire global company.
Yeah, that math is still wild to me.
We looked at the internal bleeding caused by Aspects management, the activist investor who cornered the board, forced out the CEO, and broadcasted blood in the water to the entire market.
And finally, we saw the geopolitical irony of European antitrust law accidentally rolling out the red carpet for foreign tech giants to swoop in and capitalize on a forced sale.
It is a textbook convergence of internal corporate vulnerability, mismatched regulatory frameworks, and aggressive, opportunistic global expansion.
It really is the perfect storm.
And listen, for you listening right now, this isn't just high finance happening in some distant boardroom in Oslo or Berlin.
No, not at all.
This brawl, whoever ultimately emerges victorious, is going to dictate the reality on your smartphone.
That's the bottom line.
The outcome of these multi-billion euro equity swaps will eventually dictate the delivery fees you pay, the variety of independent restaurants available in your neighborhood, and the actual platforms that survive to bring your dinner to your door.
Which leaves us with a rather vital, structural question to consider as this industry matures.
What's that?
Well, if this relentless global consolidation continues at its current pace, and highly capitalized American tech giants successfully swallow up the remaining regional delivery networks around the world, what happens to the underlying restaurants, the gig workers, and the local economies when only one or two massive, centralized algorithms dictate the terms of the entire global dining infrastructure?
Wow. That is a heavy, critical thought to chew on the next time you hear that doorbell ring with your takeout.
It definitely changes how you look at the app.
It really does. Well, we have definitely given you a lot to digest today regarding the invisible wars fighting for control of your phone screen. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Stay curious, keep asking the hard questions, and we will catch you next time.
Don't forget to like and subscribe for the next episode on While We Were Distracted.